Bible Basics Series by Timothy Von Wald.
Hey there, this is Timothy Von Wald, and I'm introducing the Bible Basics series. The purpose of this series is to get people acquainted with the Bible, to make the Bible easier to understand. And this lesson that we are covering today is called Understanding the Old Testament. Now, according to Thomas Nelson, the best way to think of the Old Testament is to think of it as a covenant. Or, in his words, the word testament is best translated covenant. Now, we might ask ourselves, what is a covenant? And a covenant is an agreement between two parties. The two parties are God and us, speaking of mankind. And what is the Old Covenant? Well, the Old Covenant is what I like to call a what covenant. It answers the question, what must I do to have a relationship with God? And the answer to that question is you must obey God's law to have a relationship with Him. And that causes us to ask the question, well, what is the law? Well, the law is the first part of the Old Testament. And that's actually what I'm about to cover right now. I got a little diagram to try to make this easier for us to understand. And the Old Testament, or Old Covenant, is actually broken up into four groups of books. And the types of books that they're arranged into is what we call literature types. The first literature type is the law, okay? And this is the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books were written by Moses, and they are God's commands given to God's people to obey. They are the most important books in the Bible, and that's why they appear in the front. And all of the prophets down here base their authority on what was written up here. They're often written in a command style, like do this, don't do that, that type of thing. Now, the second section of the Old Testament, or the second literature type, is what is known as the history. And like their form, they are written in terms of this person did this, then that person did that, then this happened, and then this person did this. You could divide the books of the history up into what I call three eras. The first era is the era of the Judges, and that is in the books Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And in this period, Israel is disorganized. They often fight as individual tribes. They are often an idolatrous nation, but sometimes they go back to a relationship with God. So they're often wavering back and forth. And because of this constant wavering back and forth in their relationship with God, they are often struggling with their enemies. Now, the second era is what I call the era of the kings. And that would be 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And in this era, Israel becomes an organized nation, and they start out fighting as a single nation. Israel starts out serving the Lord under King David's leadership, but in later years, they begin wandering into idolatry. And they start out as a united kingdom, but then they become divided, and that division creates weakness. Ultimately, they become so weak and so wander so far away from God that they are captured by the Babylonians and exiled to Babylonia. And that brings us to our third period, what I call the post-exile period. And during this period, what happens is Babylon has captured the Israelites and put them in exile for 70 years. Persia destroys Babylonia and frees the Israelites, and the Israelites renew their covenant with God. At this point, they are struggling somewhat against their enemies. But it's not like the old days. In the old days, the Israelites would often wander into idolatry. But in the post exile period, the Israelites stopped their idolatry. And they are at least trying to get back into a relationship with God. Now, in the third part of the Old Testament, it's what we call the poetry. And in this period, there's a variety of poetic books that come out. The first one is Job, um, then Psalms, then Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Now, these books of poetry are sometimes called the wisdom books because that's where a lot of the Old Testament's wisdom comes from. And these books discuss our relationship with God. They often discuss it on an emotional level, and they often deal with practical day-to-day wisdom and how God's laws actually can be applied in day-to-day life. Now, this final part down here is the prophets, and they are divided into two parts. The first part is the major prophets. That would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. And the second part is the minor prophets. And there's 12 different prophets in the minor prophets. Now, the reason why there's the major prophets and the minor prophets is because the major prophets are longer than the minor prophets. Also, unlike the minor prophets, the major prophets often deal with multiple themes in their books, whereas the minor prophets often have one theme in their book. So, to sum everything up, the Old Testament is God's covenant with God's people, the ancient Israelites. The Old Testament is what we call a what covenant. It answers the question, what must we do to have a relationship with God? And the answer is we must obey God's commands. It is divided up into four parts. There is the law, the history, the poetry, and the prophets. It shows us God's faithfulness with Israel, but it also shows us Israel's sort of wavering, sometimes faithful, sometimes unfaithfulness in keeping their commandment with God. And it also is a reflection on us living today, because this is how we learn what does God demand of us. What behaviors does God like and what behaviors does God dislike? And so this is Timothy Von Wald introducing the lesson Understanding the Old Testament, and I hope you have a pleasant day. Bye.